there anybody else who would like to be recognized? I believe Mr. Brady or Mr. Rice is recognized to offer his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Mr. Thompson has reserved a point of order, and Mr. Rice will pass out your amendment. You'll be recognized. The gentleman is recognized to speak upon his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment adds to what I was referring to earlier about the additional burden that this places on small businesses. And the gentleman from Philadelphia said earlier that this is not much of an amendment, but my friends, we have to think about the cumulative amendment, the cumulative burden that we're placing on small businesses here. I mean, it would be one thing if we're talking about a law firm that employs 50 people or a tech firm that employs 5,000, but here we're talking about employers that employ 6 or fewer people, or excuse me, 5 or more people. And what we're talking about here is landscapers and plumbers and electricians and folks who have no expertise in complying with these governmental regulations. And before we ever get to what we're talking about here with them having to offer retirement plans or face a new penalty, a $900 per worker per year penalty if they don't offer this retirement plan, and meet all these big government specified requirements. Before we ever get to that, they have to go to a lawyer and set up a company. They have to do articles of organization. They have to pay a filing tax. They have to file with their State Department of Revenue. They have to file with the IRS. They have to get an employer ID number. They have to set up a bank account and bring their employer ID number. They have to set up a payroll account. They have to file quarterly payroll tax returns. They have to file annual income tax returns. They have to do all these things in which they have no expertise. And it's already a big enough burden for people who are excited about being entrepreneurs and building the American economy and trying to get the American dream. But then they have to face all these legal hurdles, and it's almost too much. And again, here, the idea of this proposal, this bill is good. You know, we want everybody to have access to retirement plans, but they have it already. Anybody can give up to $6,000 a year to an IRA today, up to 100% of their income. And we're really not adding very much by passing this bill other than making it a little bit harder for them not to contribute. But they still can opt out. So anyway, under this amendment, this would strike the requirement that retirement plans offer an annuity. You see, under this new big government mandated specific retirement plan that your plumber now is going to have to offer and your landscaper is going to have to offer to his employees, he's going to have offer an option that they can put up to half their money into an annuity. Well, annuities are notoriously, the commissions are notoriously expensive. Insurance agents love to sell you an annuity because they collect a huge premium, a huge commission. And annuities are for some people, but they're not for most people. And if you die early, you know, if you're sick and you die early, then that annuity, you lose that. There's big cost with annuities. And employers, if they put an annuity in place, if the insurance company goes broke, which happens, then the employer can be liable for that. They don't provide any liability protection in making this annuity a requirement. So it's just one more burden that small businesses face. on top of the huge pile that we've already placed on them here in Washington. So this amendment would strike this onerous provision. It would no longer require that these small 5-person retirement plans offer annuities for up to half of their investment. This is a massive giveaway to the insurance industry at the expense of thousands of small businesses, and it makes it just that much harder. You know, maybe you're right that this is just a small amount of burden. But when you look at all the other burdens that these people face when they set up their business, the daunting task of setting up their business, and the compliance that they have to deal with every year, every month, every week, it's amazing that any small business gets off the ground. And my friends, if you adopt this bill, you're making it just that much harder. You're saying that, you know, you want everybody to have access to retirement plans. They already have access to retirement plans in the form of annuity. And for what you're getting here, the additional benefit that you get, it is not worth the additional burden you're placing on the small business owner. It is going to make it just that much harder. You're working really hard to stifle our economy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I oppose the amendment. I think that the point of disagreement we have here is not on the intent of what we're trying to do. It's over some of the specifics. And my belief here is that we're not trying to put an undue burden on the small employer as much as we're trying to help the employee who works for the small employer set the course for a lifetime of retirement savings. And I stick to the opinion that I offered earlier, that there will be a great deal of energy and enthusiasm from community bankers, credit unions, and insurance agents to sell and manage these plans. So with that, I would urge a no vote on the gentleman's amendment. Yes. Mr. Kelly, the gentleman is recognized from Pennsylvania.
I understand what the intent is, but there's such a disconnect. This is not directed at anybody.
I know.
Okay, this is just the facts, the way it is. When you are a small businessman, your cost of operation is very difficult to begin with. We already have an auto enrollment program called Social Security. A 6.2% match by both the employer and the employee up to I think it's $142,800 right now. Each one of these mandates that we impose on people creates an additional cost of being in business. And at some point, the burden gets there to which it's like, I don't know why I do this anymore. I don't know why I get up every day, put in my time. And people talk about working half days. In small business, you do work half days if you're lucky. And that's 12 hours, by the way. It's not 4 hours. There's 24 hours in the day. And for most small business people, it takes 24 hours a day to do this, plus living it. Even if you're not at your shop or at your business, you take it home with you. It's in your head all day long. I know these things are well-intended, but we are making it so hard for the people that provide the revenue to run this incredible government and thinking, well, it's only going to be a little bit more. It's only going to be a little bit more. It's only going to be a little bit more. I got to tell you, from somebody whose family started a small business in 1953 and have many times dodged a bullet and didn't go out of business, but it's surviving those times that makes you more aware of when you were careless, when things were good. I just have been not surprised, but I think I have more of an insight into this. I really do believe, and again, please, I don't want any of our friends on either side to take this as a criticism. I really wish all of us who have come and served in this wonderful government had been in private business for himself or herself and had to go through payrolls when you had enough money most times to pay your staff, but sometimes not enough to pay yourself, had worked on a commission-only basis in order to get a paycheck, and had lost your job at least once to know how valuable a job is. I don't want to be critical of us as a body, because I think we're trying to do the right thing. I just think that sometimes we don't know how difficult it is. And when we put mandates on people, all we've done is increase their cost of business. And at some point, the old story is just don't worry about the mule, just load the wagon. I think in many cases right now, the mule's going to find a way to unhook itself and stop tugging the wagon. I think it's all well intended, but I got to tell you, gang, the more burden we put on people, the harder it is for them to make a living, the harder it is to be profitable. And in my world, the only time I ever paid taxes, and there were several years I didn't pay any tax, wasn't because it was a tax sheet. It's just because we didn't make any money that year. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Is there anybody else who wishes to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me yield to Mr. Rice to close.
Mr. Rice?
Mr. Chairman, I do want to be critical of us as a body. I'm sorry, you are a good man, and I know you're trying to do the right thing here, but we're absolutely flying blind on these provisions. I mean, I'd love to have a panel of witnesses here to ask them. I'd love to have a couple of landscapers up here, maybe a couple of plumbers, a couple of electricians, to ask them how they felt about this burden, how they would feel about dealing with insurance companies and working out annuities for their retirement plans that they're suddenly going to have to offer. I'd love to hear from employees about how they felt about having these mandatory withdrawals that they have to opt out of. I'd love to hear from the NFIB and from the AICPA and from others, about an economist, about how they felt this extra burden would affect small businesses and how much the loss of opportunity for Americans and their children and grandchildren, what the cost of that would be versus the very small marginal benefit that we get from this bill. Because anybody who wants to right now can contribute up to $6,000 to an IRA, up to 100% of their pay. So we get it's not that these people can't contribute. This is just a little more push for them to contribute that they can opt out of. I'd like to talk to experts. I'd like to talk to business people about how this affects them. But Mr. Chairman, we haven't been afforded that opportunity. We didn't even see this final version of this bill until 2 days ago. I mean, probably nobody in this room, maybe except you, has read it. We don't know what the effects of this are going to be. I can tell you that the burden for small businesses is going to be just one more thing that's going to push thousands of small businesses out of creation or out of business every single year. And we're going into this blind. We're going into this unprepared. It is an awful shame that we would do this to entrepreneurs and business owners without the benefit of hearings and vetting and understanding what the effect of it would be. And Mr. Chairman, I would request that you withdraw this until we can be educated about what we're voting on here, rather than just doing it because Speaker Pelosi gives us a deadline. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman should be assured that Speaker Pelosi did not give me instruction on retirement savings. In fact, I think it's fair to say that I would give the Speaker's office instruction on retirement savings, and have done that consistently over the course of Republican speakers and Democratic speakers. And by and large, they've just about all agreed with me as time has worn on. In addition, I want to point something out. After 15 years, I have worked and sought advice and testimony on annuitization, on IRAs, on defined benefits, defined contributions, Social Security, you name it. I carved out in this Congress, I think over all of those years, a reputation for somebody who paid great attention to the whole idea of retirement savings. And we still have the same problem. It's people at the lower end that can't set aside prescribed dollars because there's not the apparatus to allow them to do it. And the notion that we're placing a burden by using tax credits for people to set up the system that will be farmed out to those I described earlier, I think is the reality of it. Appreciate the course of the conversation, but I'd like now to call the question. Those in favor of the gentleman's amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
On that, I ask for recorded vote.
Brady has requested a recorded vote. And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett?
Doggett votes no.
Mr. Doggett votes no. Mr. Thompson?
Thompson, no.
Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Larson?
No.
Mr. Larson votes no. Mr. Blumenauer?
Blumenauer votes no.
Mr. Blumenauer votes no. Mr. Kind?
Kind, no.
Kind votes no. Mr. Pascal?
Pascal, no.
Mr. Pascal votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Sanchez?
Sanchez votes no.
Ms. Sanchez votes no. Mr. Higgins?
Higgins, no.
Mr. Higgins votes no. Ms. Sewell?
Sewell votes no.
Ms. Sewell votes no. Ms. Delbene?
Delbene votes no.
Ms. Delbene votes no. Ms. Chu?
Chu votes no.
Ms. Chu votes no. Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore? Ms. Moore votes no. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee?
Kildee votes no.
Mr. Kildee votes no. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle? Mr. Byer? Mr. Byer? Mr. Evans?
Evans votes no.
Mr. Evans votes no. Mr. Schneider?
Schneider votes no.
Mr. Schneider votes no. Mr. Swazi? Mr. Swazi? Mr. Panetta? No. Mr. Panetta votes no. Miss Murphy?
Murphy votes no.
Miss Murphy votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez votes no. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes no. Miss Plaskett?
Plaskett votes nay.
Miss Plaskett votes nay. Mr. Brady?
Brady votes aye.
Mr. Brady votes aye. Mr. Nunez?
Nunes votes aye.
Mr. Nunez votes aye. Mr. Buchanan?
Buchanan votes aye.
Mr. Buchanan votes aye. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
Smith of Nebraska votes aye.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes aye. Mr. Reed?
Reed votes aye.
Mr. Reed votes aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri? Mr. Smith of Missouri votes aye. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice votes aye. Mr. Schweikert?
Schweikert votes aye.
Mr. Schweikert votes aye. Ms. Walorski?
Yes.
Ms. Walorski votes yes. Mr. LaHood? Mr. LaHood? Dr. Wenstrup?
Yes.
Dr. Wenstrup votes yes. Mr. Arrington?
Yes.
Mr. Arrington votes yes. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes yes. Mr. Estes?
Yes.
Mr. Estes votes yes. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Hearn? Mr. Hearn votes aye. Mrs. Miller?
Aye.
Mrs. Miller votes aye. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Byer?
Mr. Byer votes no.
Mr. Byer votes no. Mr. Swazi? No. Mr. Swazi votes no. Mr. LaHood?
LaHood, yes.
Mr. LaHood votes yes. Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman votes no.
Would the clerk hold on for one moment? Mr. Boyle is having technical difficulties. Is there some way, I don't think we can hold it. He's typing? I just don't think we can hold this up much longer.
It's fine.
Right. I think that we're going to proceed, and Mr. Boyle could perhaps just send a note indicating that how he intended to vote or amend the record. So with the clerk report.
Mr. Chairman, I have 24 nays and 18 ayes.
There being 24 ayes and 18 ayes, the amendment fails. Are there any other amendments in the nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman, I have
Brady is
amendments.
recognized.
Thank you. I have two amendments.
Mr.
They
Chairman.
are-
Mr. Thompson is recognized.
I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman is reserved a point of order. Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two amendments. They're both very simple, but very